typically the trees would have survived the fire, or if there was high severity, it'd be like a small little patch and then there would be seeds nearby so the forest could regenerate. And so a lot of the work that we do here is trying to understand how our forest will recover, what we can do or what managers can do to promote recovery, and what can we do before a wildfire to make sure that this is not what's happening to our landscapes. And so another recent project I worked on was really looking at, do fuel treatments effectively reduce fire severity? Is that a good strategy to try to prevent these landscapes in our dry forests where we're not seeing forest recovery and we're seeing a lot of tree mortality? And so I was able to do kind of a review of a lot of different studies that have already happened, because there's been a ton of research on this topic over the past 20 to 30 years. And so I found 40 studies that people had done. I took all their data and I put it together, so I was able to look at how different types of treatments affect fire severity. And so what I'm showing here is a change in the wildfire severity between these treated units and then the adjacent units that were untreated. So this is showing the percent change. So this -50 is the fire severity. The treated unit was 50% lower than the adjacent untreated unit that burned on the same day under the same conditions, and it was right nearby. And so what you can see is that treatments are highly effective within the unit, right? So our thin and prescribed burn, which is what that RX burn is, reduced fire severity on average by 72%. Thin and pile burn reduced fire severity by 62%. So even in areas where we have more trouble getting fire on the landscape, we could use pile burns, and that's still pretty effective. Prescribed burning only was also really effective. And then you can see where we only thin, but we didn't use any fire or remove the surface fuels, it was less effective. And that's some cases even higher fire severity in these treated units, because if you leave a lot of slash on the ground, that can increase the surface fire intensity and kill more trees. And then interestingly, we looked at prior wildfire, because as we have more fires on the landscape, they might be an opportunity to be a treatment or act as a treatment, right? And what we found was there's variability in whether the prior wildfire helped reduce future fire severity depended on how the first fire burned. So all of these points up here that increase the fire severity, those burned at high severity in that first wildfire, and largely those were in California where there's a big shrub response, there's a lot of dead trees fall, and there's lots of shrubs, and so then they reburned at high severity. But all of these points over here, they burned at low or moderate severity in the first fire, and that kind of propagated another low or moderate severity fire in the future. So wildfires that burn under moderate fire weather conditions that are burning at low or moderate severity are really also an effective treatment for our landscapes, which is good news since we have way more wildfire on our landscape than we can possibly, mechanically go in and treat or use prescribed fire for. So that's just looking at the effectiveness of these treatments. But another ecologist here at the lab, Sharon Hood, has some long-term fuel treatment studies where she's looked at the effects on these treatments over time. So since the 1990s, there's two different sites. One, the Lip Creek Forest, Research Demonstration Forest, is down on the Bitterroot. This study's been going on since the 90s, and they've actually been able to do two treatments about 20 years apart, different combinations of thinning and burning, different subcultural prescriptions, and then looked at how that affects the tree mortality, fuel structure, fire risk, all sorts of different things over time, and to also help us kind of understand when do we need to go back in and retreat these forests, how fast are the fuels coming back. And likewise, there's another study on the University of Montana experimental forest that's just to the northeast of here that Sharon's been involved in, that is also looking at different combinations of treatments, and they just retreated this site as well last year. And so some of the benefits of doing these long-term studies is that we have these kind of stochastic events or surprise events that happen that help us learn. So for example, this is the study site out at Lubrecht, the University of Montana forest. There was a big beetle outbreak after these treatments had happened, and that allowed Sharon to go in and see how do these treatments affect survival through a beetle outbreak. And so what she learned was that in the sites that were thin only or thin and burn, there was almost no mortality from this beetle outbreak, and in the control sites there was 50% mortality of the ponderosa kind. So having this long-term experiment helped us answer questions that we couldn't even have foreseen. And it's great because it's showing, other benefits of these treatments besides just reducing fire risk. And likewise, down at Lick Creek, there was a period of drought. And so Sharon was able to look at she cored all the trees and looked at the tree growth through that period of drought, and the trees in the treated units kept growing at their normal rate, and the trees in the control units stopped growing and were really stressed during that drought period. So the treatments helped with beetles, and they also helped with the drought. And then another thing that we looked at down at Lick Creek just 2 years ago was pollinators, and trying to understand, do these treatments impact pollinators and other life forms besides trees? And what we saw was that in this thin and burned treatment, this is the number of visits by different pollinator groups. We saw a lot more honeybees and flies in those areas that had been treated with prescribed fire and thinned. So there's more sun, there's more plants, there's more flowering plants. So we also counted the number of flowers, and there's more flowers available for the pollinators. And that seems to be really helping the bees. So another co-benefit of treatments. And then finally, a lot of my research looks at what's happening after the fire, and so trying to understand, why do we see great forest recovery in some places, not in others, and then what will happen if an area that was recovering from a wildfire burns again in a shorter time frame. So this is an example of a lodgepole pine forest that historically would burn once every 100 years or so, regenerate really well, like that picture on the left, but then this one burned again 20 years later. And so that's increasingly happening, and so we're trying to figure out, what are the impacts of that. And then we're using the data that we're collecting to build models that we can project the likelihood of natural tree regeneration under different climate and fire severity scenarios. And so what this figure is showing is models that we've developed of the likelihood of natural regeneration of our most common species under a high severity scenario where there aren't a lot of seed sources nearby, which is really one of the most important drivers of post-fire tree regeneration, or a low severity scenario on the bottom, and changes in climate through time. And so our work is really showing climate is increasingly stressing trees and the ability of the trees to regenerate, but also the ability for managers to alter fire severity and leave more trees that survive the fire on the landscape has an even bigger impact. And so that's a little bit of a hopeful message. And then we're using these tools to create, or these models to create tools for managers. So when there's a fire in their district, they can come to our web tool, and we'll use these models to give them a map of where there might be natural regeneration, where they might need to go in and plant trees, and where is the climate best for planting trees. And this is just one example where on the left we're showing this is a perimeter of a fire. These red areas, we don't expect trees to regenerate naturally, but that was largely because it was a large high severity patch. There's no seed sources nearby. And if you look on this map of climate suitability, it's blue, really suitable for trees. So they might say, this is an area I'm gonna go plant trees because they're not gonna regenerate on their own, but they're probably gonna survive if I plant them. So we're trying to develop tools that make it easier for people to prioritize where they can plant trees and be successful. And then finally, the next step is we're also doing studies where we take data that they've collected on seedling survival, or do some experiments of our own to understand what are the factors that determine whether or not these trees that we plant are surviving, and how can we increase the survival of these trees that we're planting following a fire. And that's all. But I'm happy to take questions.
Are you continuing the fire effects database on the shrubs and different grasses and the fire effects that you used to have?
The fire effects information system?
Yeah.
Yes, that still exists. Alana, we have multiple people who work on that and are updating all of the information for the different species.
It's moved over to a new database.
Oh, yes. Yes, it has a new back-end system,
Okay.
but it should still be functioning and everything should still be there. Yeah, and there's still many people working on that.
Oh, good.
Yeah.